So the Ashmolean Endowment was launched in 2014. We actually started endowment fundraising a little bit beforehand in 2013. The reason for launching then there were several reasons. Firstly, we'd refurbished the museum in 2009 and reopened a really fantastic museum which had doubled the gallery spaces. We had a new conservation studio, education space. We had new exhibition galleries. So really we were coping with sort of increased space and increased ambition. We tripled our visitor numbers, so we went from about 300,000 visitors to about 950,000 visitors where we are now. And we really realised that actually, in order to maintain this building and to maintain our core values of display, research, teaching and care of the collections, we needed a sustainable source of income that would last us for generations to come, which is what led us to launch the Endowment Fund, which we publicly launched in 2014. And the reason that it took over three centuries to do so is simply because of rising costs of running a museum. Our operating budget in the last 10 years has increased by over a third. It's also to do with decreased funding from other sources. So at the moment we have about 50% of our funding comes from external sources, which is difficult to rely on, and it's difficult for us to really plan effectively for the future. So having an endowment was a good way for us to have a sustainable and robust source of funding for years to come. And the final reason is we're a department of the University of Oxford. The University of Oxford has the largest fundraising campaign in Europe. It also has a significant endowment. Strategically, the university is moving very much towards having all of its constituent departments and colleges relying more on their endowment funds and again encouraging them to have a more sustainable source of funding. So the endowment sits very centrally in the museum's strategic plan, which calls for a sustainable source of funding. The development team is very much integrated within the museum. The head of development sits on the executive management group and reports to the board of visitors. So it's really something that the museum has invested a lot of time and energy in over the last 4 or 5 years. And it's something that will continue to be an institutional priority. Obviously, this makes it difficult to balance against everyday funding needs. For example, our core costs of keeping the buildings open, our costs of running 3 exhibitions a year, of improving our gallery spaces, and of taking on important projects such as digitising our collection. So what we try to do is operate a first among equals situation, so that the endowment has the priority and will always be our first thought, but we try to run a mixed economy. We support our departments and our curators in fundraising as much as they can, so that our energies can be really directed in building up our endowment and ensuring that we're getting that message out there. So I think probably our biggest challenge, and I'll start with the challenges first, our biggest challenge was the fact that we had for years been engaged in capital fundraising. So we had to contend with a lot of donor fatigue. So, you know, our traditional donor base really had been so kind of motivated by the capital campaign that it took a while for us to be able to go back to them and ask for significant endowment gifts as well. We did a lot of research. We looked at our comparator organisations, we looked at our university alumni and people who have a passion for the kind of work that we do at the Ashmolean, for the subject areas that we have. We built up a good network of volunteers. We worked with our board of visitors. We worked with our development campaign board to make sure that we were getting the right introductions and we were meeting the right people. I think going back to the challenges, another thing that we found difficult to begin with was having a robust case for support. So being able to convince people that the endowment is something that they should invest in. And to do that, we really needed to tell a story about why the endowment was important. What would its impact be now, as opposed to giving to a capital campaign, which is obviously a very obvious and visual and tangible impact, why should you fund the endowment? But also really telling that story about how it will preserve the museum for future generations. And finally, I think the final challenge that we had was in how we talk about our finances. As a museum and as a department of the University of Oxford, we needed to be able to tell a very clear and concise story of how our finances work, how our operating budget worked, and also to be able to talk to people convincingly who are often much more experienced in finances than we are ourselves. So being prepared to answer very difficult questions about investment returns and the structure of the endowment and how we calculate our endowment costs, and those are some challenges that we had to overcome. We set ourselves an initial target of £25 million in 2014, which we were to reach by 2020. We are very, very fortunate in that we have been able to access 3 sources of match funding during our campaign. So firstly, we applied to the UK's Heritage Lottery Fund, which is the body that distributes funding from the National Lottery. They granted us a conditional match funding challenge award, whereby if we raised £1 million, the Heritage Lottery Fund would give us £1 million in return. We also, one of our major donors to the museum, pledged an anonymous challenge fund of £5 million, which was another pound-to-pound match. So that really helped us. And finally, the University of Oxford a couple of years ago announced the Endowment Challenge Fund, which matches eligible gifts to the endowment on a 2-to-1 basis. So for every 2 donor pounds, the university will put in a further £1, so it increases the value by 50%. So so far £7 million of our endowment has come from that match funding, which has been a real motivator for our donors. We also found that we had great momentum in our campaign. So once we'd taken the decision to launch the campaign, we were obviously talking to our donors and talking to our prospects and trying to get them excited about the endowment. And we received significant gifts in advance of officially launching the campaign. Every campaign plateaus, and there have been times within the last 4 or 5 years where actually, things have been relatively slow. But what we found was we had a sort of initial rise, a period of plateauing, then another rise, and then a small plateau towards the end. So, I think a combination of having really great match funding, having really committed donors, building really good relationships with those donors and with our volunteers to expand our networks, and really being able to capitalise on that momentum have enabled us to achieve our targets. So the main donors, they're really a mix of people. We have a lot of our donors have some existing link to the University of Oxford. They might be alumni, or they might just, be locals to the city of Oxford. We also have a lot of people who are very interested in the work that we do, so people who have a passion for example, our Egyptian collections or for our Western art collections. So they've been quite kind of obvious choices for us to focus on as we built up our endowment campaign. They tend to be based mainly in Britain and the US, mainly the east coast of the US. And thinking about our kind of international profile is something that we're really keen to do in the next phase of our campaign. It tends to be individual donors, so single major gifts or a consortium of major gifts from a group of donors, with a little bit of trust and foundation support, and very, very minimal corporate support. So we compete very much on a national and international scale. So we consider ourselves in similar ways as the V&A Museum in London, the British Museum, the National Gallery, the National Portrait Gallery, but also with the Met and with other major museums in the US. So we are very ambitious, even though we have, comparatively quite a sort of small team and a small operating budget. We're very, very ambitious, and we consider ourselves to be sort of working in that level. We also work within the University of Oxford, and there are other parts of the university that are competing for the same kind of donors. So that's another area for us to be aware of. So primarily, the endowment supports people. People give to people, and that's something we found to be true over the 5 years of our campaign. So it mainly supports our head of curatorial departments and our curators. The way that we calculate our endowment costs is we take the annual cost of the post, the sort of average annual cost of the post, taking into account inflation and pay rises, and then we multiply that over 25 years. That gives us an annual drawdown of 4%, and that does entirely fund the cost of a curatorship. So we really try to avoid a situation where a donor might give us partial endowments, because that means that we're committed to then either trying to find the funding for the rest of the endowment or filling that gap ourselves. So we really try to find either a single donor or a group of donors who will be able to cover the full cost of the post, so the salary, the pension contributions, and all the other costs associated with that. So as part of the University of Oxford, we actually invest with Oxford University Endowment Management. They are a wholly owned subsidiary of Oxford University. And they have about 32 organisations investing in their endowments. That's the University of Oxford and 25 of the university's colleges, which are all separate financial entities. So it's a big investment management, and it is very well respected. The head of the fund is very well respected in the finance world. And they sort of smooth out the returns of the investment, so that we have an annual investment of about 4%, which means that in leaner years, hopefully there will be still enough left within the endowment to fully cover the costs. So yes and no to both sides of that question. I think one of the things that really inspired us to grow our endowment was the HLF Heritage Lottery Fund Catalyst scheme. We were one of a number of organisations who were grantees in that scheme. And of those, a number of them have not continued to pursue the endowment as such a central part of their fundraising. And that's for various reasons: exhibition costs, capital costs, and the other day-to-day costs that you have to prioritise against building an endowment. So I think it's becoming more of a feature of UK cultural fundraising, but I think we have a way to go before we're like the US, for example, where endowment fundraising is really sort of second nature to us. And I think that goes for us as a fundraising community, as much as the donors as well, who need a little bit of education. And in terms of us being an inspiration to smaller local museums, I hope so. We are a relatively small museum, as I said, but we do consider ourselves to be competing on a national and international scale. However, we are extremely fortunate to be part of the University of Oxford. We consider ourselves to be the open door to the university's research, and as such, we're very fortunate to have a very close working relationship with the university. So we have a lot of resources that come from that, and I think smaller museums where the fundraising team might be only, one or not even a whole person, somebody who's picking it up alongside a number of other things. I can totally see why an endowment, might not be the number one priority when there's 100 other things that seem more important. Again, I think endowments are becoming more popular, and that's something that I've been finding sort of anecdotally. A lot of my colleagues and peers have been, talking a bit more about endowments and about building endowments and seeking advice on it. But again, I think we have a long way to go before it becomes, really ingrained in our fundraising culture. And I think it's partly because you need significant institutional buy-in in order to be able to focus on the endowment. We're really lucky that we've had that from our director, our board of visitors, our senior curators, and the university's leadership as well have been really encouraging us to focus on endowment. And that's meant that we've had the time and the space to really invest in it. And that's the key thing, I think, that is potentially holding other institutions back, which means that endowment fundraising is not quite there yet.